On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection in Florida State Prison. In her final statement, she made references to a mothership and the movie Independence Day. Some called it evidence of insanity. Others saw it as proof of manipulation. But before we decide what those final words meant, before we determine who Aileen Wuornos really was, we need to go back to the beginning. Because this case isn't just about 7 dead men and 1 woman's death sentence. It's about evidence the jury never saw, a love affair that ended in betrayal, and questions that remain unanswered more than 2 decades later. Tonight, we're examining one of the most controversial criminal cases in American history. Not to tell you what to think, but to present you with facts that might change how you see everything. By the end of this video, you'll have information that challenges the narrative you've heard before. What you do with that information is entirely up to you. Let's begin with what we know for certain. Aileen Carol Pittman was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, was convicted of child molestation and later died by suicide in prison. Her mother, Tyria Moore, left when Aileen was 4 years old, and Aileen was raised by her maternal grandparents. Court records and later testimonies indicate that Aileen's childhood involved physical abuse and that by age 11 she was engaging in sexual activities with older boys in exchange for money and goods. At 14, she became pregnant, gave birth to a son who was placed for adoption, and was subsequently removed from her grandparents' home. She spent her teenage years living on the streets, supporting herself primarily through prostitution. By her early 30s, Aileen had accumulated an extensive criminal record, including arrests for prostitution, theft, forgery, and assault. She moved frequently throughout Florida, living in cheap motels and temporary accommodations, continuing to work as a sex worker. In 1986, Aileen met Tyria Moore at a gay bar in Daytona Beach. The 2 women began a relationship and moved in together shortly afterward. According to multiple accounts, Aileen was the primary financial provider for the couple, continuing her sex work while Tyria had limited employment. Friends and acquaintances would later describe Aileen as deeply devoted to Tyria, while descriptions of Tyria's feelings toward Aileen varied significantly depending on who was asked. On November 30, 1989, 51-year-old Richard Mallory was last seen alive. His body was discovered 2 weeks later in a wooded area near Interstate 75. He had been shot 3 times with a .22 caliber weapon. His car was found abandoned and his personal belongings were missing. Over the next 12 months, 6 more men would be found dead under similar circumstances. David Spears, 43, discovered June 1, 1990. Charles Carskadden, 40, found May 31, 1990. Troy Burris, 50, discovered August 4, 1990. Charles Humphreys, 56, found September 12, 1990. Walter Antonio, 60, discovered November 19, 1990. Peter Seams, 65, disappeared June 7, 1990, and his body was never recovered, though his car was found crashed and abandoned. All of the victims were middle-aged white men traveling alone. All had been shot multiple times. All had their vehicles and money stolen. Witnesses began reporting sightings of 2 women, 1 blonde and 1 brunette, in connection with several of the stolen vehicles. Police sketches were created and distributed. Fingerprints and palm prints recovered from 1 vehicle were matched to Aileen Wuornos in the criminal database. On January 9, 1991, Aileen Wuornos was arrested at a biker bar in Volusia County on an outstanding warrant for weapons violations. At this point, police had circumstantial evidence and forensic connections, but no confession. Tyria Moore had already left Florida and returned to her family in Pennsylvania. Here's where the case takes its first significant turn. Police located Tyria Moore and brought her in for questioning. They presented her with a choice: cooperate with the investigation or potentially face charges as an accomplice. Tyria agreed to help. Over the course of several days in mid-January 1991, Tyria made multiple phone calls to Aileen, who was being held in jail. These calls were recorded by police. In these conversations, Tyria expressed fear that she might be arrested and charged. She told Aileen that police were questioning her and that she was scared of going to prison. Aileen's response, captured on tape, was immediate and clear. She told Tyria that she would confess to everything to keep Tyria out of trouble in one recorded call. Aileen said, "I'm not going to let you go to jail. Ty, I love you. If I have to confess everything just to keep you from getting in trouble, I will." And she did. Aileen Wuornos confessed to killing all 7 men. She provided details about each murder. She insisted repeatedly that Tyria Moore had no involvement and no knowledge of the crimes. Now we need to examine what Aileen actually said in her confession, because the details matter. Aileen claimed that Richard Mallory, her first victim, had raped her. She stated that he had become violent, tied her up, and sexually assaulted her, and that she shot him in self-defense when she managed to reach her gun. She initially claimed that all 7 killings were acts of self-defense, that each man had either attacked her, attempted to rape her, or threatened her with violence. However, under interrogation, some of these claims became inconsistent. For some of the later victims, the self-defense narrative was less clear. Investigators noted discrepancies in her timeline and details. The prosecution would later argue that these inconsistencies proved she was lying about self-defense entirely, that the murders were premeditated robberies from the start. Aileen Wuornos went to trial for the murder of Richard Mallory in January 1992. Her defense team presented her history of childhood abuse, sexual assault, and trauma. They argued that on the night of November 30th, 1989, Richard Mallory had violently raped her, and she had killed him in self-defense out of fear for her life. They called expert witnesses to testify about the psychological effects of prolonged abuse and trauma. The prosecution presented a different narrative. They argued that Aileen Wuornos had lured Richard Mallory to a secluded location with the intention of robbing and killing him. They pointed to the pattern of subsequent murders, the theft of vehicles and money, and what they characterized as the calculated nature of the crimes. In cross-examination, the prosecutor questioned Aileen's claim of rape, asking how she could claim assault when she had agreed to sex for payment and was already undressed. The jury found Aileen Wuornos guilty of first-degree murder and recommended the death penalty. The deliberation took approximately 90 minutes. But there's a crucial piece of information that the jury never heard. After Aileen's conviction, it was discovered that Richard Mallory had a criminal history. Specifically, he had been convicted in Maryland of attempted rape and had served 10 years in a prison psychiatric facility. Documents showed that he had been accused of violent sexual assault against women and had pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity to charges of assault with intent to rape. Aileen's defense attorneys had attempted to introduce this information during the trial, arguing that it corroborated her claim that Mallory had attacked her. The judge ruled the evidence inadmissible, stating that Mallory's past criminal behavior was not relevant to determining whether Aileen had acted in self-defense on that specific night. After conviction, Aileen's lawyers filed for a retrial based on this excluded evidence. The motion was denied, Legal experts remain divided on this decision. Some argue that a defendant's claim of self-defense can be supported by evidence that the alleged attacker had a history of similar violent behavior. Others maintain that prior bad acts are generally inadmissible because they are prejudicial and don't prove what happened in a specific incident. The question remains, would the jury have reached a different verdict if they had known about Richard Mallory's criminal history? Following her conviction for the Mallory murder, Aileen Wuornos was tried and convicted for 3 additional murders. She pleaded no contest to 2 others. For the Peter Sims case, where no body was recovered, she was not charged due to insufficient evidence. She received multiple death sentences. During her 10 years on death row, Aileen gave several interviews that documented her changing mental state. Early interviews showed her maintaining that at least some of the killings were self-defense. Later interviews revealed increasingly paranoid thinking, with Aileen making claims about sonic weapons, conspiracies among prison staff, and other statements that mental health professionals characterized as potentially psychotic. In her final interviews, she recanted her self-defense claims entirely, stating that she had killed all the men in cold blood and deserved to die. This raises another complicated question. Which version of Aileen's story was true? The initial claims of self-defense, the confessions designed to protect Tyria Moore, the later recantations made while her mental state was deteriorating. When someone's statements change over time, particularly under extreme stress and possible mental illness, how do we determine which version represents the truth? And then there's the matter of Tyria Moore. Tyria Moore was never charged with any crime. According to police, she had cooperated fully with the investigation, and her testimony confirmed that she had no direct involvement in any of the murders. However, the extent of her knowledge has been debated. Aileen claimed in various statements that she had told Tyria about at least some of the killings, and that Tyria had helped dispose of evidence and had spent money taken from the victims. Tyria denied having detailed knowledge of the murders until police informed her. What is documented is that after Aileen's conviction, Tyria Moore sold her story. She signed deals with production companies and media outlets to tell her account of her relationship with Aileen Wuornos. Some reports indicate she received substantial payment for these rights, though exact figures were never publicly confirmed. Tyria gave interviews for documentaries and films, including cooperation with the production of the film Monster, though she did not appear on camera for most projects. In later interviews from death row, Aileen spoke about Tyria with a mixture of continued affection and bitter resentment. She stated that loving Tyria was the biggest mistake of her life. She said she felt used and betrayed, yet even in these statements, there were moments where Aileen expressed understanding of why Tyria had cooperated with police, and suggested she didn't blame her for wanting to avoid prison. The question viewers must consider: what was Tyria Moore's moral and ethical responsibility in this situation? Setting aside the legal question of whether she could have been prosecuted, what did she owe to Aileen? What did she owe to the truth? If she genuinely had no knowledge of the murders, did she have an obligation to refuse to participate in the recorded phone calls that led to Aileen's confession? If she did have some knowledge, was her cooperation with police a reasonable act of self-preservation or a betrayal of someone who loved her? There's no objectively correct answer to these questions. Let's examine some of the broader context that surrounds this case. The legal treatment of sex workers who claim to be victims of violence has been extensively documented by criminologists and legal scholars. Studies have shown that sex workers face extraordinarily high rates of violence, including rape, assault, and murder, and that they are far less likely than other victims to receive protection from law enforcement or credibility in court. The prosecutor's question to Aileen about whether she could be raped after accepting payment for sex reflects an attitude that has been challenged by victim advocates, who argue that consent to one sexual act does not constitute consent to all acts, and that payment does not forfeit a person's right to bodily autonomy. At the same time, the pattern of multiple victims, the theft of property, and the evidence that Aileen continued to kill long after the initial incident with Richard Mallory complicates any straightforward self-defense narrative. Even if the first killing was justified, what about the subsequent 6? Aileen's own accounts of these varied, sometimes claiming each was defensive, other times suggesting she began targeting men preemptively because she assumed they would attack her. The role of childhood trauma in violent behavior is another area of ongoing research and debate. Aileen's documented history of severe abuse, abandonment, and exploitation from a young age fits patterns that psychologists have identified in individuals who later commit violent acts. However, many people experience similar trauma without becoming violent. The relationship between victimization and perpetration is complex and not deterministic. Does understanding the origins of someone's violent behavior change our moral or legal judgment of their actions? The handling of Aileen's mental health raises additional concerns. Multiple mental health professionals who evaluated her over the years noted symptoms consistent with various disorders, including post-traumatic stress disorder, borderline personality disorder, and in her later years, possible psychotic features. Her final statements before execution, including references to being killed by radio waves and returning to a mothership, led some experts to question whether she was competent to be executed. Others argued that she understood the nature of her sentence and had made a conscious choice to stop appealing her death sentence. Florida law requires that a person being executed must understand why they are being executed. The question of Aileen's competency in her final years remains contested. It's also worth noting that Aileen Wuornos was only the second woman executed in Florida since the reinstatement of the death penalty, and one of relatively few women executed in the United States during the modern era of capital punishment. Some researchers have examined whether her execution reflected gender bias, either in her favor through years of appeals or against her due to the particularly sensationalized nature of her crimes as a female serial killer. So what are we left with? We have a woman with a documented history of severe childhood trauma and abuse who killed 7 men over the course of a year. We have her claim that the first killing was self-defense, supported by evidence about the victim's history that the jury never heard. We have a confession obtained through the exploitation of her relationship with a woman she loved. We have inconsistent statements made over 10 years, some while she was potentially experiencing serious mental illness. We have a legal process that some view as fundamentally fair and others see as deeply flawed. What we don't have is a simple answer. Was Aileen Wuornos a serial killer who deserved execution? Was she a victim of lifelong abuse who finally fought back? Was she both? Was she neither? Did the criminal justice system work as intended, or did it fail everyone involved, including the 7 men who died? These aren't rhetorical questions, they're genuine dilemmas that this case presents, and different people looking at the same evidence reach different conclusions. What's important is that you look at all the evidence. The facts that support the prosecution's case, and the facts that support the defense. The evidence that was heard, and the evidence that was excluded. The statements Aileen made to protect someone she loved, and the statements she made when that love turned to bitterness. The context of her life and the consequences of her actions. This case challenges us to think about justice, about culpability, about what we owe to victims and what we owe to defendants. I'm not going to tell you what to think about Aileen Wuornos, but I am going to ask you to think carefully, to consider the complexities, to sit with the discomfort of not having a clear answer. If this video gave you something to think about, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into complex criminal cases. Leave a comment and tell me what you think. Not what you're supposed to think, but what you actually think after considering everything we've discussed. Until next time, keep questioning, keep thinking, and remember that the truth is rarely as simple as we want it to be.